But I did say one thing that night, which I have seldom said on this show over the years. You finished your routine, and you were devastating, and the audience was just falling apart, and you walked over and sat down.
Johnny Carson always looked friendly on TV, but behind that smile was a man who never forgot when someone crossed him. One small mistake, one rude moment, even one joke he didn't like, and a guest could be banned for life. They weren't just taken off the show, they were erased, as if they never existed. Some broke big rules, others didn't even know what they did wrong. Now, the secrets behind Carson's 8 most shocking bans are finally coming out. The dual nature of Johnny Carson. For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television with a smile that could light up millions of living rooms across America. He was the king of charm, the master of timing, the host who made everyone feel welcome. A single appearance on The Tonight Show could turn an unknown comedian into a household name overnight. Carson had that kind of power, and he wielded it with effortless grace. But behind that famous smile lived a different man entirely. Those who worked closely with Carson knew the truth that viewers never saw. He was not the easygoing, forgiving personality he projected on camera. Johnny Carson could be ruthlessly unforgiving when someone crossed him. If you violated his trust or disrespected his show, you were done forever. Carson operated with what people called a Sicilian-style code of conduct. There were no loud confrontations or dramatic blow-ups. Instead, your name simply disappeared from the guest list. Phone calls went unreturned. You ceased to exist in Carson's universe. What made these bans devastating was Carson's immense influence throughout the entertainment industry. His disapproval carried weight far beyond his own show. Producers hesitated to book guests who had fallen out of favor with the king of late night. Their stories reveal the unwritten rules of Carson's kingdom and the heavy price paid by those who broke them. Carson's invisible rulebook. Johnny Carson never handed out a rulebook to his guests. There was no written list of do's and don'ts posted backstage at The Tonight Show. Yet every successful performer who appeared on his stage understood that certain boundaries existed, invisible but absolutely real. Break one of these rules and you might never return. The first unspoken law was perhaps the most important. Never embarrass Carson on his own stage. This was his kingdom, his carefully constructed world where he controlled every element. You could engage in playful banter, even gentle ribbing, but crossing the line into genuine mockery was strictly forbidden. The second law demanded that guests never ambush Carson with politics or personal agendas. Carson worked hard to maintain political neutrality on his show. He wanted The Tonight Show to be an escape for viewers, not another battleground for divisive issues. The third rule prohibited challenging the sincerity of Carson's persona. Guests who suggested his warmth was fake or his reactions were calculated hit a nerve that ran deep. The fourth law was simple but absolute. Never threaten Carson physically or emotionally. Any hint of violence or intimidation resulted in immediate and permanent exile. The fifth rule demanded that guests always bring fresh material and respect the craft of comedy. Carson had no patience for performers who recycled old jokes or seemed creatively lazy. These 5 laws governed Carson's kingdom with iron authority. 8 guests, in particular, experienced the full force of Carson's quiet wrath. The first, and perhaps most painful exile, was someone Carson had once considered family. Number 8. Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers was more than just a successful comedian who appeared on The Tonight Show. She was Johnny Carson's hand-picked protégé, his chosen successor, the daughter he never had. Carson discovered Rivers when she was struggling to break through in the male-dominated world of stand-up comedy. He saw something special in her sharp wit and fearless delivery. In 1965, he invited her onto his show, and the appearance transformed her career overnight. But Carson did not stop there. He continued to champion Rivers, bringing her back again and again, giving her opportunities that other comedians could only dream about. The relationship deepened over the years until Carson made an unprecedented decision. He named Joan Rivers as his permanent guest host, the first woman ever to hold that position. This was not just a professional courtesy. Carson trusted Rivers to protect his show when he took his frequent nights off. For Rivers, this represented the pinnacle of professional achievement. Carson had become a father figure, a mentor, a protector, but in 1986, everything fell apart. The Fox network approached Rivers with an offer to host her own late-night talk show. Rivers accepted the deal, but before she could personally inform Carson, news of the contract leaked to the press. Downey seemed to view Carson's professionalism as weakness, his neutrality as boring, his controlled environment as outdated. Carson watched this performance with growing disgust. He saw Downey not just as a difficult guest, but as a symbol of everything that was degrading television culture. Downey represented a shift toward sensationalism, toward prioritizing shock value over quality entertainment. For Carson, who had always maintained high standards for his show, Downey's approach felt like an assault on everything he had built. The appearance ended badly, and Carson's decision was immediate. Morton Downey Jr.'s name was quietly removed from all future guest lists. The ban was Carson's way of drawing a clear line between his vision of late-night television and the chaotic future that performers like Downey seemed to represent. Carson learned about his protégé's departure not from Rivers herself, but from industry gossip and newspaper reports. The betrayal devastated Carson. He did not see this as a normal career move. In his mind, Rivers had abandoned him without the courtesy of a direct conversation. She had chosen to compete directly against him, and worst of all, she had let him find out through outside sources. Carson's response was swift and absolute. He erased Rivers from The Tonight Show as if she had never existed. Letters she sent were returned unopened. Gifts arrived at the studio and were sent back without acknowledgement. The industry took notice of Carson's fury, and many professionals distanced themselves from Rivers out of loyalty to the king of late night. Rivers' career tumbled dramatically. Her Fox show failed quickly, and without access to The Tonight Show, her visibility diminished. The ban remained in effect for 28 years, lasting until 2014, 9 years after Carson's death. But Rivers was not the only guest whose comedy style ultimately cost them Carson's favor. Another performer discovered that when jokes become too uncomfortable, even brilliance cannot save you from exile. Number 7. Charles Grodin. Charles Grodin was a master of uncomfortable comedy. His specialty was playing a version of himself that was deliberately difficult, confrontational, and slightly hostile. Audiences watching The Tonight Show never quite knew if Grodin was joking or if genuine tension existed between him and Johnny Carson. That ambiguity was precisely what made his appearances so compelling. Grodin would complain about his dressing room, criticize the production quality, or pretend to be offended by something Carson said. For years, Carson seemed to appreciate Grodin's unique approach. The uncomfortable exchanges created memorable television moments that stood out from typical celebrity interviews. Grodin appeared on the show multiple times, and his segments generated strong audience reactions. People talked about his appearances the next day at work and around dinner tables. In the world of late-night television, that kind of buzz was valuable currency, but Grodin eventually crossed an invisible line that Carson had drawn. During one particular appearance, Grodin took his confrontational character too far. He began mocking what he perceived as Carson's emotional distance and lack of sincerity. The jokes hit a nerve that ran deep into Carson's most vulnerable insecurities. Carson had always worried about whether his on-screen warmth seemed authentic. He feared being seen as cold or calculating behind his famous smile. The appearance ended, and Grodin left the studio thinking everything had gone well. But he never received another invitation to The Tonight Show. There was no phone call from producers, no formal announcement, no explanation. Carson simply stopped booking him. Grodin eventually realized he had been quietly banned. The confrontational comedy that had once made him a memorable guest had finally become too uncomfortable even for a host known for his professionalism. Carson apparently decided that the tension Grodin created was not worth the personal discomfort. While Grodin's exile came from pushing comedy too far, another entertainer discovered that physical intimidation resulted in even swifter consequences. Number 6. Wayne Newton. Wayne Newton was one of Las Vegas's biggest stars, a performer whose shows packed showrooms and generated millions of dollars in revenue. But despite his success, Newton became increasingly frustrated with Johnny Carson's comedy routines. For years, Carson had included Newton in his monologue jokes, and these jokes often carried uncomfortable implications. Carson made repeated references to Newton, suggesting through innuendo and word choice that the singer might be gay. In the era when these jokes aired, such insinuations could damage a performer's career and personal reputation. Newton initially tried to ignore the jokes, hoping Carson would eventually move on to other targets. But the teasing continued and escalated. Carson seemed to view Newton as an easy punchline, someone whose stage persona and mannerisms made him a natural target for comedy. Newton felt humiliated and disrespected. He believed Carson was using his massive platform to mock him unfairly, and the jokes were affecting how audiences perceived him. Finally, Newton decided he had endured enough. Instead of calling to complain or sending a letter through representatives, Newton took dramatic action. He somehow bypassed Tonight Show security and stormed directly into Carson's private office. The confrontation was brief but intense. Newton made it clear that if the jokes continued, there would be physical consequences. He issued what Carson interpreted as a direct threat of violence. Carson, despite being caught off guard, responded with cold authority. He dismissed Newton sternly and made an immediate decision. Wayne Newton was banned from The Tonight Show, effective immediately and permanently. Carson had a zero-tolerance policy for physical intimidation, and Newton had violated one of the most sacred unwritten rules. The ban had real consequences for Newton's career. Without regular Tonight Show appearances, his national exposure diminished significantly. While Newton's ban came from a moment of explosive confrontation, another guest's repeated on-air disasters led to an equally permanent exile. Number 5. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters had been a Hollywood legend for decades, an Academy Award-winning actress whose performances earned critical acclaim and audience admiration. Throughout the 50s and 60s, she delivered powerful work that established her as one of the industry's most talented performers. But by the time she appeared on The Tonight Show in later years, something had changed dramatically. Winters struggled with alcohol addiction, and her behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Carson had witnessed concerning behavior from Winters during previous appearances. She often arrived at the studio in questionable condition, her speech sometimes slurred, her thoughts wandering in directions that made interviews difficult to manage. Carson was patient at first, understanding that many performers struggled with personal demons. He tried to guide conversations carefully, steering them away from uncomfortable moments and protecting Winters from embarrassing herself too severely on national television. But one particular appearance crossed every possible line. Winters arrived clearly intoxicated, far beyond the point where Carson could salvage the situation through skillful hosting. As she settled onto the guest couch, it became immediately obvious to everyone watching that something was terribly wrong. Her speech was nearly incoherent, her thoughts disjointed and rambling. She struggled to follow Carson's questions or respond in ways that made sense. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence. Carson attempted to end the segment early, trying to cut to commercial break before things deteriorated further. But before he could escape, Winters did something that shocked everyone in the studio. In a moment of inexplicable impulse, she picked up a glass of whiskey and threw the contents directly into Carson's face. The liquid splashed across his suit and dripped down his carefully composed expression. The studio audience gasped audibly. Producers backstage immediately cut to commercial. Security personnel quickly escorted Winters from the studio while Carson cleaned himself up. Behind the scenes, Carson's decision was absolute and immediate. Shelley Winters would never set foot on The Tonight Show stage again. The ban was permanent and non-negotiable. For Winters, the consequences extended beyond just losing access to Carson's show. Her late career visibility suffered tremendously. Number 4. The Smothers Brothers. The Smothers Brothers had built their careers on a unique blend of musical comedy and increasingly bold political commentary. Tom and Dick Smothers were not content to simply entertain audiences with songs and jokes. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, they used their platform to speak out against the Vietnam War, to challenge government policies, and to push boundaries that most entertainers avoided. Their own television show had been cancelled precisely because of their controversial political content. When the Smothers Brothers appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson expected them to deliver the musical comedy routines they were known for. He had made it clear to producers and to the brothers themselves that political commentary was not welcome. Carson had carefully cultivated The Tonight Show as a politically neutral space, a refuge from divisive issues that dominated news broadcasts across America. But during one particular appearance, the Smothers Brothers decided to ignore these guidelines. They began their segment with music and humor as expected, but then shifted into political messaging that had not been approved or discussed with producers beforehand. They used Carson's platform to deliver anti-war sentiments and criticize government policies, essentially ambushing Carson with content he had explicitly forbidden. Carson was furious. He felt disrespected and manipulated, angry that the brothers had violated the trust he placed in them. The ban that followed was somewhat unusual. Rather than permanently closing the door forever, Carson instituted a soft ban with strict conditions. The Smothers Brothers were allowed to return eventually, but only under very specific terms. They had to agree in advance that no political content would appear in their segments. But while they eventually found their way back onto Carson's show under restricted conditions, another performer simply vanished from the guest list without warning or explanation, leaving everyone puzzled about what had gone wrong. Number 3. Rich Little. Rich Little was one of the most beloved impressionists in America, a performer whose ability to mimic famous voices seemed almost supernatural. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Little was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, appearing more than 30 times over the years. But behind the scenes, Carson was growing increasingly irritated with Little's behavior. The problem was not what Little did on camera, but rather what happened during commercial breaks and in the green room. Little could not seem to turn off his impressionist persona. He constantly performed voices, cycling through his repertoire of characters even during casual conversations. What audiences found charming for a 5-minute segment became exhausting for Carson during longer interactions. Carson also began to believe that Little was relying too heavily on old material. The same impressions appeared again and again, with little variation or innovation. For Carson, who valued fresh comedy and creative evolution, this stagnation represented a kind of professional laziness. The ban came without warning or explanation. Little simply stopped receiving invitations to appear on The Tonight Show. Little learned through industry sources that Carson had grown tired of his off-camera performances and felt disappointed by the lack of creative growth. While Rich Little's exile came from subtle professional disappointments and behind-the-scenes exhaustion, another celebrity's appearance became a spectacle of public deterioration that left Carson with no choice but to act decisively and protect his show's dignity. Number 2. Truman Capote. Truman Capote had once been one of America's most celebrated authors, a literary genius whose works like In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's had defined an era. His distinctive voice, flamboyant personality, and sharp wit made him a natural fit for talk shows. Carson had welcomed Capote onto The Tonight Show multiple times during the author's peak years, and those appearances had been memorable and entertaining. But by the late 70s, Capote was in serious decline. Years of alcohol and substance abuse had taken a devastating toll on his physical and mental health. His once sharp mind had become clouded, his famous wit dulled by addiction. Friends and colleagues watched helplessly as one of literature's brightest talents destroyed himself slowly and publicly. When Capote appeared on The Tonight Show during this period of decline, the results were painful to watch. He arrived at the studio visibly intoxicated, barely able to walk steadily to the guest couch. As the interview began, Capote's speech was heavily slurred, his words running together in ways that made him nearly impossible to understand. He struggled to follow Carson's questions, his responses wandering off into incoherent tangents that made no sense. Carson tried desperately to salvage the segment asking simpler questions and attempting to guide Capote toward coherent answers. But nothing worked. Capote made inappropriate comments, forgot what he was saying mid-sentence, and created an atmosphere of deep discomfort in the studio. Capote's ban resulted from personal demons destroying professional relationships, a tragic fall from literary greatness. But another television personality brought a completely different energy to Carson's stage, one that clashed violently with everything Carson represented and threatened the very foundation of what he believed late-night television should be. Number 1. Morton Downey Jr. Morton Downey Jr. represented everything Johnny Carson was not. Where Carson was calm and controlled, Downey was loud and aggressive. Where Carson maintained careful neutrality, Downey thrived on confrontation and controversy. Downey had built his career on a talk show format that featured screaming matches, chain smoking on camera, and deliberately provoking guests into explosive arguments. His show was chaotic, unrefined, and designed to shock viewers rather than entertain them with sophistication. When Downey appeared on The Tonight Show, the clash of personalities and philosophies was immediate and uncomfortable. Downey could not or would not adjust his aggressive style to fit Carson's format. He hijacked the stage, speaking over Carson, insulting other guests, and indirectly criticizing the refined approach that Carson had spent decades perfecting. Carson's power, standards, and legacy. Each ban revealed something important about Carson's character and his vision for The Tonight Show. He demanded loyalty from those he elevated and supported. He insisted on professionalism and preparation from every guest who walked onto his stage. He required respect for the craft of entertainment and the intelligence of his audience. He refused to let his show become a platform for chaos, politics, or degrading spectacle. Carson's control over American entertainment meant these bans shaped careers for decades. Being exiled from The Tonight Show was not just losing access to one television program. It meant losing visibility, losing opportunities, and often losing relevance in the broader entertainment industry. Carson's disapproval carried weight that extended far beyond his own studio. The legacy of these bans reminds us that Johnny Carson was not simply a friendly face on television. He was a powerful gatekeeper who built and maintained his empire through carefully enforced standards. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.